Thanks. Wow, thank you so much. Is this working okay? You hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm reminded of a young priest friend of mine who was a really bright guy. You know, he was saying his first mass, and he had a really responsive congregation, and you know, they knew the answers forever and ever. Amen. Lord be with you, and also with you. You know, but when he got up to the mic with his very well prepared sermon, he tapped it and it didn't seem to work, and tapped it again, and he said, "There's something wrong with this damn thing." And also with you was the immediate response. So when I walked in here just now, somebody asked, could they put a microphone on me? And I said, well, I already had one. And they said, well, we have another one. And so I said, were you from Homeland Security? And he said, no, NSA. So out here in the West, they're less sophisticated. They ask you before they put the mic on you. So, I mean, I think that's good, but you know, I thought high-tech stuff was here in Seattle. Anyhow, I want to talk a little about a lot of things tonight, but I want to make sure that you feel comfortable enough to interrupt me at any point. And I think we have lots of time, so let's do it that way. I want to start out talking a little bit about faith and faith-based things. And when George W. Bush came into Washington, of course, he was big on everything that was faith-based, you know. And so he introduced the concept of faith-based intelligence. And I heard a story one time which illustrates what faith-based intelligence is worth in a very vivid way, and I'd like to draw from my Irish heritage to tell you that story. So, it's a winter's night in Belfast, and two nuns are driving home from the hospital where they work. It's getting dark, and don't they run out of petrol. They stop the car on the side of the road, look under the boot, look under the bonnet, no gas can. But there was a bedpan from the hospital. So I said, well, this is better than nothing. They went, got some petrol, and they came back, and the one nun is struggling. I don't know if you realize, but bedpans are very unwieldy when they're full. She's struggling with it. The other one's opening the gas cap there, and screeches to a halt. Big limousine, big one, the fancy one, like, you know, you push a button and the window gets down by itself. A fellow looked out the window, and who was it but the Reverend Ian Paisley, the head of the Protestants there in Northern Ireland. He took a look at the sisters, and he said, sisters, I don't agree with your religion, but I do admire your faith. Thanks for getting it. You know, I told that joke at the Oxford Union during a debate, and there was nothing. Well, Elizabeth, you were there, right? They didn't get it. And then about 2 minutes later, one said, you know, and they all explained it to one another. And these are the rulers of Great Britain, you know, upcoming. Now, before I forget, I want to introduce Elizabeth. Would you just stand up? Elizabeth Murray is one of our veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity. And she was second in command of Near East analysis. She was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Middle East when she retired 3 years ago now, Elizabeth? 3? Something like that. And she decided to get as far away from Washington, D.C. as she could, and she found that Bellingham, Washington was about as far as you can get. So that's where she settled down. I haven't seen her since we were in Oxford together, so it's nice to have that reunion. So, as some of you know, I'm just back from Russia, where 3 whistleblowers and that was really quite an experience. I'd like to share just a little bit of it in conjunction with what else we're going to say. We award an award every year for integrity and intelligence. And no, it's not an oxymoron. There used to be this concept. And we've awarded it 12 times now. And when Edward Snowden did what he did, we circulated around the suggestion that, well, maybe he's our nominee for this prize this year. And to some of it seemed like a no-brainer. To others, not so much. The Sam Adams Associates are, as you would imagine, intelligence professionals of various backgrounds, very serious military folks, very senior officers, and a lot of people felt very strongly, well, we ought to take a real look at this. You know, he has released a lot of very sensitive information, and, you know, would it be harmful to our country, or maybe just harmful to the government for revealing, you know. Anyhow, we went through this, and we waited a decent interval, about 6 weeks. And then we said, well, let's bring it to a vote. You know, we're sort of an action sort of group. Let's vote on it. So it was a distinct majority for it. So we awarded him the honor, and then we said, now we need to give it to him because it's our tradition to make this award in person. We've always done it in person. That's why we ended up in Oxford. The last award winner was Thomas Finger. Anybody know who Thomas Finger was? That's really interesting, isn't it? Because Thomas Finger stopped the United States from going to war with Iran. You know, after the debacle of Iraq, where the evidence was not mistaken, folks, it was fraudulent, okay? You know, face-based intelligence, you know, was worse than what was in what Paisley thought was in that bedpan, right? And, you know, don't take my word for it. J. Rockefeller, who was head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, after a 5-year study by that committee, said that the evidence used to justify the war in Iraq was unsubstantiated, contradicted, comma, and even non-existent, period, end quote. Now I ask you folks what non-existent intelligence looks like. Forgery, that kind of thing? Well, anyhow, after that was over and it was behind us, someone with some good sense said, you know, Iran is next in the crosshairs. It was very clear. And so let's try to get somebody with a record for integrity to come in here and run the estimate on Iran. And they couldn't find anybody except in the State Department, the head of State Department Intelligence, Tom Finger. He was an assistant secretary of state, very senior official, but he'd been around the intelligence community almost forever. Now he's teaching at Stanford. In any case, they asked him, would you shepherd the estimate? These national intelligence estimates are sort of the acme of the intelligence project. And would you do the one on Iran? Come on in and do it. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. I've been through that Iran. I said, no, why not? He says, well, if you let me take 3 or 4 of my best experts on Iran from the State Department, yeah, I'll do it. And he did, and they did, and he did. All throughout 2007, they struggled with this estimate. The record had been that every 5 years, the intelligence community would pronounce, since about 1990, that Iran is, we think, about 5 years away from a nuclear weapon. 1995, they're about 5 years away from nuclear weapon. 2000, probably about 5 years. It got a little embarrassing, okay? So he threw out all the estimates, and he did a ground-up study, and he found out, as some of you know, unanimously agreed to by all 16 intelligence agencies of the United States government, that Iran stopped working on a nuclear weapon in the fall of 2003. Now, I'm not real good at arithmetic, but I did the math before I came here. That's 10 years ago, okay? It had not resumed work on a nuclear weapon. Now, that judgment, by the way, has been reiterated and revalidated every year since in formal testimony. I wish I could brag about formal testimony from the National Intelligence Director, but as you know, he's a self-confessed perjurer because he denied that NSA did any collection on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans. Anyhow, it does mean something that every year they've revalidated it. And how do you stop the war? Well, he didn't do it single-handedly. But it was a big surprise. 3 weeks before the estimate came out, first week of November 2007 now, okay, George Bush was saying, Iran's about to get a nuclear weapon. They're going to get a nuclear weapon. We have to do something to stop that. And some press person says, well, are you sure? Why do you? He says, well, what do you want? World War III? Is that what you want? Is that what you want? World War III? You know? And 3 weeks later, this estimate comes out. Now, the problem for them was a PR problem. How are they going to handle this thing, right? And I don't know if this is the way it happened, but I think it did. The people that really didn't want to attack Iran, what part of our government were the people that really didn't want to attack Iran? I'll give you a hint. They wear uniforms and they got stars on their military, right? They knew what that would be like. That'd be crazy. It would make Iraq look like a volleyball game between Mount St. Helena's or the Ursuline Academy, you know? And so what I think happened was they went to George Bush and said, now, Mr. President, this estimate, it's a terribly embarrassing estimate, isn't it? Oh, yeah, big surprise. Well, it's out there, and Congress has it, and it's going to leak for sure. It's going to leak. And, you know, we think you should get ahead of the curve, and so you can put your own spin on it. So why don't you issue an unclassified version of this? Put your own spin on it. This thing was unspinnable, you know? It was 180 degrees of what he'd been saying. So Bush said, well, yeah, we get a good spin on it. You see something really, really tragic or really, really pitiful, watch Stephen Hadley, the National Security Advisor at the time, get up and try to explain all this, you know? Iran's still a threat. And they're not, we're going to nuclear weapon. There's still a threat. There's still a threat. Why? So anyhow, how do I know that this stopped the war? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but one is if you read Bush's memoirs. Now, I don't expect you to go out and buy the book. Please do not go out and buy the book. If you're looking for the book, you'll find it in the fiction section because my Code Pink folks have made sure that it got there, okay? But, yeah, and you go to page 474 or something like that, and Bush, in his own words, must be his own words, says, this was a shocker, an eye-popping disclosure. It deprived me of the military option. And this is a quote, for how could I justify ordering our armed forces to attack the nuclear development facilities of a country that the intelligence community said had no active nuclear weapons program? Bummer! I says it right in, I mean, you would think, what would the normal reaction be if you found out that they weren't working? Wouldn't it be, if it were a surprise to you, wouldn't it be, call Tel Aviv, this is great news, hey, they're not working, wow, you know, instead of that, bummer, you know? So that's a kind of long-winded way of saying that it was Tom Finger, a guy with integrity, okay, who saw to it that an honest estimate was prepared. He took all kinds of heat from the John Boltons and others of this world. It was just, they put him through, and he stuck around long enough to protect all those people who wrote the estimate, you know, the analysts. And then he left and he's teaching at Stanford now. Long story short, he was at Stanford in January, and I was invited to do a little debate there, one of those Oxford debate things. And so we said, hey, let's do the Sam Adams Award in Oxford. And so he was our last awardee, and he's unusual in as much as most of our Sam Adams Awards are given to whistleblowers. And it was, you know, Tom Finger that made it unnecessary for anybody to blow the whistle because he told the truth, you know. Hello, you know, that's what we used to do, told the truth. So the Sam Adams Award is named after a colleague of mine who entered the CIA at the same time I did. Actually, it was the same day, in 1963, when John Kennedy was president. He had served in Vietnam in the Navy. He's out of Harvard, really bright guy. Went to Harvard Law School, said this is for the birds. He didn't want to be, you know, he didn't want to continue there. So he came down for this very attractive offer, which attracted me as well, of being an analyst for the CIA, where you would be given in your little inbox, and most of you are probably old enough to remember that we used to have inboxes made out of wood. Can you believe it? When I talk at colleges, they say, what kind of inbox was this? You know? Into our inbox would come all manner of information from all, you know, from press, from spies, from photography, from intercepted messages, from, you know, from from wherever. The FBI even shared information with us every now and then. And we would be responsible. I'm far enough away from Washington to use the following word. We would be accountable. We would be accountable for looking at what information was available, and if it were important enough, we would serve it up to the president, and somebody might correct the syntax or the misspellings, but there was no political thing on this, I mean, we told it like it is, and we had career protection for telling it like it was. Many of us bent the noses of 4-star journals way out of joint by saying, for example, bombing? You think you're gonna close the Ho Chi Minh Trail by bombing? When Giap, the general, just died, I was thinking, wow, I remember those days. There was lots of talk of the patter of little brown feet. And in contrast, the B-52s with these big bombs. They were gonna seal the Ho Chi Minh Trail and make Giap and Ho Chi Minh give up. We knew better than that. We told LBJ that. But he heard from the generals that, no, this would do it. You see, the generals gave LBJ the idea that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was sort of like I-5, or I-95, or, I-66. We had to explain to him, no, you can't even see it from the air. Anyhow, he didn't want to be the first president to lose a war, and so he became the first president to lose a war. So there are those political things, and intelligence can just do so much. But I want to tell you just a little bit about Sam Adams and what he stood for. He was so bright that they gave him the account of counting up how many enemy there were in South Vietnam, okay? Communists under arms. Now, would you believe that as of 1964, nobody had counted them up, except the military way back in 1956 or 57? And we had been killing so many of them under Westmoreland's, pretensions, that he had imposed an artificial limit. There could be no more than 299,000 Vietnamese communists under arms. Couldn't be any more than that. Does that specific number give you any doubts? It's sort of like 1,429 people killed by chemicals outside Damascus, The precision itself gives it away, right? Probably when they say, how many? Well, let's say 1492. No, 1490, that's already been used, 1490, too familiar. Let's do 1429. Yeah, that's it. Give me a break. Anyhow, in all seriousness, Sam went over to Saigon, found out that the general just wouldn't abide by the fact that the real numbers were between 500 and 600,000, okay, in the South, all right? And in a bar that night, this sergeant came up from the intelligence unit, and he said, Mr. Adams, I know you're totally confused because, a battalion usually does have 500 men, and they always have it when put it on the OB in the order of battle. So it's 250 for us, 500 for you and everybody else, but you're not going to make any way here because Ho Chi Minh knows that Westmoreland won't allow more than 299,000. It was crazy. So Sam came back in high dudgeon, okay? And we used to have lunch, and I'm talking to him about all this. And I said, why would Westmoreland deliberately underestimate the number of people he's facing? It doesn't make any sense. Generals tend to exaggerate the enemy. He said, well, Ray, they've killed so many every week, and the press isn't really smart in Saigon, but they do arithmetic, And if all of a sudden he says, oh, no, there are twice as many, or even that there's more than 299,000, oh, that could be trouble. I said, oh, come on, Sam. He says, Ray, the day was August 20th, 1967. He said, Ray, we got a secret NODIS. NODIS means no dissemination cable in from Saigon last night from General Abrams, who was General Westmoreland's deputy. Westmoreland was traveling around somewhere in Southeast Asia. Now, I have the text of that cable, and I'd like to read it to you, just the portion that matters, because I don't want to misquote it, and I want to put on my glasses so I can read it. Okay, the date is August 20, 1967. This is Abrams, quote, "We cannot accept the higher numbers because we have been projecting an image of success over recent months, and all available caveats and explanations will not prevent the press from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion." I said, "Sam, he wrote that in a cable? It's available in black and white?" He said, "Yeah." Now, Abrams was a big tank commander in World War II, okay? Who's the big tank? Patton. Patton said that the only person as good as me in tanks is Abrams. Well, you know, tanks but no tanks. When there are no tanks, okay, he wasn't real bright and he wasn't really good about what was going on in Vietnam. They named the tank after him, the big Abrams tank. So that was what he faced. And to his credit, I suppose, Sam obeyed all the rules and went through channels, went to the Inspector General of the CIA, tried to get the director, Helms, fired. You can imagine how far he got with that. Went to the Inspector General of the Defense Department, went to Congress, nobody would listen to him. That was 1967, okay? We had lost about 25,000 people. The Vietnamese had lost about 1,500,000 people. Where do I get that figure from? Secretary of Defense McNamara, who says that Vietnam lost 3 million people altogether, okay? And so Sam went to his early death, sudden heart attack at age 56, I think he was. No other symptoms, with profound remorse, with great regret that he had let himself be diddled within the system. If he had gone to the, now I'm going to say something that will surprise you. If he had gone to the New York Times bureau in Washington, the surprise here is that the New York Times used to be an independent newspaper, and actually they would print something like this without checking with the White House. That, you know, they wouldn't ask for permission like they do now. They would have put it on the front page, and that could have shortened the war, because there it was, a document. What you need is documents. So it's what my friend Dan Ellsberg always says: don't just speak out, bring the documents. And Bradley Manning or Chelsea Manning did that to her fairly well, didn't he? 700,000 documents. And to his credit, Ed Snowden went through the documents that really needed to be released and figured out a way to get him out of Dodge, okay? So what I'm saying here is that the Sam Adams Award is made in recognition of Sam. He did the work, but he didn't go out of channels, and most of our whistleblowers had to, okay? And Ed Snowden is the par excellence example of that, because he saw what happened to Bradley Manning. He said, "I don't want to be tortured by the Marines for 8 months." And he saw what happened to Tom Drake. Tom Drake, the NSA senior executive, who released information about billions and billions and billions of dollars being wasted on a system that deprived us of our rights under the Fourth Amendment, where he and other experts within House had created a system that preserved those rights and was more efficient. And he went to the Baltimore Sun and told them finally. First he went through all kinds of channels, you know, defense, Congress, everything else, didn't get anywhere. So what did he do when he told them? The Justice Department charged him with 10 felonies under the Espionage Act. He was going to be put away for 35 years, was told that, you know, and they brought these charges. Long story short, Jesselyn Radak, who's a lawyer with the Government Accountability Project, but was a lawyer with the Justice Department, took up the cause. She did the PR of this. He used the public defender of the state of Maryland for his, he didn't have any money for his defense. And at the end, the federal judge said, you know, you people, you so-called lawyers from the Department of Justice, you should be ashamed of yourself. You should be really ashamed of yourself. This case had no basis from the beginning. You wasted all our time, and you put Tom Drake through 4 years of persecution. You should be ashamed of yourself. Now, what did Tom do? I don't know how this works legally, but he pled out to a misdemeanor for having exceeded the authorized use of a government computer. In other words, he wrote a letter to his wife or something on a government computer or something like that. So, point here is that Ed Snowden watched what happened to Tom Drake. So here we are, exactly a week ago, or actually a week ago last night. We're in Moscow, and we're ushered into this nice dining room, and there's Ed Snowden. And let Tom go before me, and Snowden looks at Tom Drake, and you could just see it in his eyes. This guy saved my life. This guy saved my life. You know, I knew what I had to do to get out of Dodge. I never could have achieved my mission if I'd gone through channels, and so I figured out a way, you know, to do it. And Tom Drake is looking at Ed Snowden, and he's saying, my God, I never thought any good would come out of those 4 years of persecution. But this is a good, you know. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, oh gosh, this is wonderful, you know? This is really wonderful. Then we had a chance to ask Snowden, you know, your major concern, of course, was that you could sacrifice all this. You give up everything, maybe your life. You said you were willing to do that, and your main concern was nothing's going to happen, right? Nothing happens. Are you aware, Ed, that a lot of stuff is happening? He said, yeah, I am, yeah. And Colleen Rowley and Jesselyn Radek, both lawyers, really up on the legislation that's being prepared now. Some of it quite promising. We're able to fill them in on some of those details that haven't been on the web. Now, if it's been on the web, Snowden's seen it. You know, he's really engaged. And, you know, I just say one more thing about Snowden. You know, people say, well, why do you go to Moscow? Was this rearranged? Did the Chinese turn him down? Why is it, you know, he's a traitor. You know, what's her name? Dianne Feinstein. He's a traitor. Well, I'll tell you who the traitor is. It ain't Snowden, okay? What, yeah. What he did was very artfully figure out a way to get in touch in a confidential way with Greenwald and Laura Poitras, arranged to meet her in Hong Kong, and got all the stuff out, and got to Hong Kong because he knew he could get to Hong Kong from Honolulu without being intercepted and discovered. He couldn't get to Latin America any other way. And so there he is in Hong Kong, meets with them, gives them the stuff. And of course, they're journalists. They're not, you know, Good Samaritans or Red Cross people, so they go back and write their stories. And there's Ed Snowden. Hello, you know. Hong Kong is sort of dithering. And who saved him? WikiLeaks. Yeah, WikiLeaks. Julian Assange sent his right-hand person there, Sarah Harrison, down, and he said, you know, do what you can. See if you can get him, you know, he's got to go through Moscow. He wants to get to Havana, so talk to the Russians. And so she goes to the consulate there and arranges for him to get out of Dodge. And he just got out of Hong Kong before they were going to keep him there. Now, was he headed to the Soviet Union? No, he wasn't headed to the Soviet Union. Or Soviet Union, gosh, that really dates me, doesn't it? To Russia? No, he wasn't going to end up in Russia. It was sort of like, you know, I was comparing it in my mind to Columbus, okay? It was Columbus Day that we were on Amy Goodman. And I was thinking, you know, I remember a history book that started out this way about the discovery of the New World. America was discovered by somebody who's looking for something else. The next 2 years, the next 2 decades, the next 2 centuries were spent trying to figure a way through it or around it. It was named after somebody that had nothing to do with the discovery of America, and the people there were called people from the other side of the world. You know, history is very, very chancy like that and very ironic. Well, here's Ed Snowden, you know, he wants safety, he wants security, he wants not to be killed. So he wants to get to Latin America. He has no intention of when he got to Moscow, he wanted to get around or through it, right? He couldn't. And in the end, because of the US imperiousness, John Kerry saying, all right, Vladimir Putin, we know there's no extradition agreement here, but you must give up Ed Snowden because we want him and we say you must. Well, that was a big mistake. Vladimir Putin doesn't take kindly to that kind of thing. And besides, you know, you could seek the high moral ground by obeying international law. You know, there used to be some premium in obeying international law. It still is among some countries. And so he said, yeah, come on in here. Now, what's the result? The height of irony. Ed Snowden is in the safest place on the globe. Why? Well, you may know that 2 weeks ago, General Michael Hayden, who was head of the CIA and the NSA, suggested openly, you know, I've got a list that I'd like to put Ed Snowden on a different kind of list, not a list for an award. But and Mike Rogers, head of the House Intelligence Committee, chimed in, yeah, I can help you out on that. You know what list I'm referring to? The kill list for assassination, the one that President Obama on Tuesday morning carefully reviews and decides who will live and who will die, including American citizens. I hope none of you are shocked to hear that. There used to be a Fifth Amendment that would prevent that, but that's gone by the board, just like the First and like the Fourth, what we're talking about now. So what was I saying? The kill list, yeah. So Michael Hayden and Michael Rogers have said, you know, this guy should be killed. And I said to Snowden, I said, are you aware that these guys have said that? He just looked at me, he shook his head like, yeah, I'm aware, he said. Like, what's become of our country, you know? What's become of our country? This is not the mafia. They're not supposed to be the mafia. But this is Mike Rogers. Now, I'll tell you a little secret here, not to leave this room. Mike Rogers is a failed special agent for the FBI. How do I know that? I won't tell you how I know that. But some of the circumstantial evidence is that he left after 4 years. You never leave the FBI after 4 years. You're just about to become vested, right? You're just about to get all kinds of emoluments and so forth. Well, he left under something of a cloud. And now what is he doing? He's overseeing the intelligence community and parts of the FBI. Well, you know, do you think maybe the FBI has something on Rogers that they could disclose? Anyhow, the whole thing is so darn corrupt. And of course, this mass interception and mass monitoring of communications, you know, that's what J. Edgar Hoover did to it fairly well, and that's why they created a law against it. Anyhow, so the thing with Snowden was just beautiful. And I'd like to, I think it's probably worth reading just a little bit of one of the, well, we had a formal ceremony to give him the award, but we each said something. Jesselyn Radek, Tom Drake, myself, and Colleen Rowley. And Jesselyn read something from Albert Camus. And maybe some of you have seen that. I wrote it up, but let's just to give you a little feel for what that was all about. She said, Edward Snowden, you're in good company. Now, Snowden had talked about the work of a generation, okay? He wrote a statement for the European Parliament Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs. And Jesselyn went to Geneva, I think it was, to read it. And the title he gave it was The Work of a Generation Starts Here. Now, she pointed out that the wager of our generation is how Albert Camus described what Ed had called the work of a generation. It was 1957, the year that Camus won the Nobel Prize for Literature. At that time, Camus expressed the hope in the quality of a new generation and its increased unwillingness to adopt slogans or ideologies and to return to more tangible values. He wrote, quote, "We have nothing to lose except everything, so let's go ahead. This is the wager of our generation. If we are to fail, it is better in any case to have stood on the side of those who refuse to be dogs and are resolved to pay the price that must be paid so that man can be something more than a dog." Camus rejected what he called the paltry privileges granted to those who adapt themselves to this world, adding that, quote, "Those individuals who refuse to give in will have to stand apart, and they must accept this." Camus, quote, "Personally, I've never wanted to stand apart, for there is a sort of solitude which is certainly the harshest thing our era forces upon us. I feel its weight, believe me. But nevertheless, I should not want to change eras, for I know and respect the greatness of this era. Moreover, I have always thought that the maximum danger implies the maximum hope. In December 1957, the month he won the Nobel Prize, he warned strongly against, quote, he said, remaining aloof has always been possible in history. When people did not approve, they could always keep silent or talk of something else. Today, everything has changed, and even silence has dangerous implications. I think that has relevance to today. Jesslyn Rada continued, a key figure in the French resistance, Camus, in July 1943, published a, quote, letter to a German friend, an old friend that he had had for decades. He said, quote, you, the friend, you said to me, the greatness of my country, Germany, is beyond price. Sound like maybe he thought it was an exceptional country, or maybe the sole indispensable country in the world? Or? Okay. The greatness of my country is beyond price. Anything is good that contributes to its greatness. Those who, like us young Germans, are lucky enough to find a meaning in the destiny of our nation must sacrifice everything else, end quote. Camus. No, I told you. I cannot believe that everything must be subordinate to a single end. There are means that cannot be excused. And I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice. I don't want for my country a greatness born of blood and falsehood. I want to keep it alive by keeping justice alive. You retorted, the German, Camus saying to the German, you retorted, well then you don't love your country. Jesselyn wrapped it up by saying, Edward, you don't love your country probably has a familiar ring to you. But of course, the truth is the very opposite. Let's take one more cue from Albert Camus, who emphasized that, quote, truth needs witnesses. We are honored, Edward, to be here at this time and this place to be your witnesses. You have the full measure of our gratitude and support. And that was just one of the statements. Colleen Rowley read another, and I read a little Russian poem. It was really interesting. We were hosted officially by Anatoly Kucherina, who is a civil rights lawyer and one of the lawyers that is supporting Edward Snowden. And he's a great, big, wonderful, burly Russian guy, you know, and he gave us all gifts through a translator, inscribed books. And the last one he gave out was Pushkin. And that gave me a chance to try to follow Cicero's dictum of trying to render your audience benevolent, attentive, and docile, because I know a lot of Pushkin, okay? And I know one poem, Pushkin, that, anybody here know Russian? Oh, usually up in the Northwest we have some, okay. Well, I'll translate it anyway. It's a poem that Pushkin wrote when he was behind bars in Kishinev, now in Moldavia, I guess it is, because he spoke out, you know, he wrote subversive things in his poems. And this one is titled Uznik, which means prisoner or somebody kept in captivity. And he's sitting in his little cell, and he's looking out the window. And it goes like this. Сижу за решеткой в темнице серой, вскормленный в неволе орел молодой. Okay? I'm sitting behind the bars of this window in the dark, dank cell, cooped up like an eagle who can't fly away. Мой грустный товарищ, макая крылом, кровавую пищу трет под окном. He looks out and he sees this crow waving his wings and picking up a piece of a dead animal and you know, throwing it at the window. Клюет и бросает, и смотрит в окно, как будто со мною задумал одно. He's clutching at this thing, and then he looks into the window, And he looks at me as though he has the same thoughts that I have. Подокно. И вымолвил хочет, давай улетим. He says to me, let's fly away. Мы вольные птицы, пора. We're free birds, let's go. Туда, где затухшая белеет гора, туда, где синеют морские края, туда, где гуляем лишь вечер тая. We need to fly away to that place beyond the snow-capped mountains that I just saw flying in yesterday, beyond the blue seas that surround our country, and beyond where only Dieter, the wind and I, can fly. Now, why do I take you through all that? Well, Pushkin is their national hero. I mean, my feeble attempt to render him probably doesn't do him justice, but that sort of gave us a real welcome with Kucherina, and it kind of was just fortuitous that the book he happened to give me was a series of Pushkin short stories translated into English. So, he lived in the first part of the 19th century, so he was part of that insurrection that really never got off the ground. He spoke out in favor of the Decembrists, which was really the first Russian Revolution. These guys had chased Napoleon back into Western Europe, and they looked around and said, hey, pretty nice place. How do they rule themselves, They heard about Konstituция, Constitution. And so, without much preparation, they drew themselves up before the square in St. Petersburg and shouted out, Konstantin I Konstitucja, meaning bring Constantine into power and the Constitution. Now, no other Russians except the ones that had been chased Napoleon knew what Konstitucja was. They knew what Constantine was. But the Tsar just brought his folks out and they shot them all and imprisoned the rest of them. But that's a measure of how people find out a different way of doing things and act on it. Now, I want to say a couple things about the late, lamented, dearly departed General Keith Alexander. Let's have a moment of rejoicing that Keith Alexander's gone. Good riddance. Keith Alexander is, for the next few months still, the head of the National Security Agency and the U.S. Cyber Command. Cyber Command? Yeah. You've heard about how we very artfully with the Israelis set back the Iranian nuclear development program with the Stuxnet. We're pretty smart, we can do that. How smart is that? Just as sort of an aside here, the battles of the future are not going to depend on battleships or aircraft carriers or B-52s or F-35s. It's going to be cyber. And so the great big advantage that the United States now has, to its detriment, of spending half of our tax money on defense, it's not going to amount to a hill of beans. You know why? Because well-educated Iranians, well-educated Chinese, Japanese, well, that's all it takes, to do this cyber warfare. And there are just as many of them, and some of them are better educated than there are of us. Add to that the fact that NSA and our government, to the degree it wants to do this, cannot do it without people like Edward Snowden. Just can't do it, okay? So this whole generation that's grown up, they're technically incredibly proficient, okay? And they want to have good jobs, and a lot of them end up at the NSA and other places to get good pay. But, some of them, maybe, 5% have a conscience. And some of them remember the solemn oath that all of us who serve in the armed forces, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I mean, that's what Snowden remembers. He was a soldier for a while. That's what I remember. And we talked about that over dinner. You know, is this an oath that has an expiration date? No, it doesn't, you know? And so what are we to do? Are we supposed to sit back and watch this happen? You know, when I'm doing interviews these days, people don't seem to have any concept of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. And I know you do, but I'm going to read it to you anyway, because you can see, just by hearing it, how much flaunted it is by what's been happening. Quote, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized," end quote. Well, hello. You know, put that up against the dragnet, the collect everything mentality. So, you know, the natural conclusion is that there's probable cause to believe that all of us are a bunch of terrorists, right? How many terrorists here? I guess we're all suspected terrorists, you know? Yeah, I mean, look at it, yeah. And so that's a measure of what we're up against. Now, I said that I'd do something about the empire here, so I'll say something about the empire. Well, first I'll say what I learned first about the empire when I was about 8 years old, and my Irish grandfather said, "Raymond, you've heard about the British Empire. Do you know why they say that the sun never sets on the British Empire?" I said, "Yeah, I think I know, Grandma." No, you don't know. Just sit down there and I'll tell you what it is. So, all right. He said, the sun never sets on the British Empire because the good Lord would never trust the British in the dark. Well, after World War II, you know the story. I remember where I was born a week before Hitler began the war with Poland. And my first, well, even in the womb, I suppose, you know, people were really upset about all this that was happening. So I grew up with that ambiance, that environment, and I remember a lot of it. But after the war, 1948, when I was 11, when I was 9, I guess. Here's what the first policy paper of the newly created State Department's Policy Planning Council said. Now, this was written by a fellow who used to be my hero. His name was George Kennan. Many of you know who George Kennan was, ambassador to the Soviet Union, you know, Russian expert par excellence, you know, author of the containment policy, you know. It really wrote well for Moscow and so forth. Well, this is what he said in the first policy paper. Okay, this has set the policy for the U.S. after the war. "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of the world's population. So our real task in the coming period is to maintain this position of disparity. Now, to do so, we will have," this is a direct quote, folks, I'm not paraphrasing. "To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford the luxury of altruism. We should cease to talk about vague, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we will have to deal in straight power concepts." End quote. George Kennan, 1948. Now, George Kennan, I've later learned, was responsible for making the CIA a hybrid. You see, President Truman knew what happened at Pearl Harbor. He was hell-bent and determined that wouldn't happen again. There'd be no surprises. There would be a central place, therefore a central intelligence agency, where in that inbox would come all manner of information. Somebody would be held accountable for looking at it and warning about these things. Most of you know that before Pearl Harbor, there were all manner of little things floating around, from the FBI, from the code breakers, from the people in Embassy Tokyo, from the FBI. Where was the Japanese ambassador? So, and there was a little submarine in the Honolulu harbor, and where was the Japanese fleet? I mean, does anybody think, we lost track? We lost track of the Japanese fleet, So that was not going to happen again. So therefore, Central Intelligence Agency, and this agency would report directly to the president, not to the Pentagon. Truman knew that the Pentagon would always say the Soviets were 12 feet tall. He knew they weren't 12 feet tall. The State Department would say they were only 5 feet tall. He knew they, so he needed his own. He needed people who had no agenda except to tell the truth. Now, I know, even out here in the West, people would wince and say, right, right. An agency with no agenda, yeah, I'll give you a break. You say that in Washington, they just kind of stare in disbelief. But it was true. When we were hired, Sam Adams and I, we were told that we could tell it like it is. And almost always we were able to do that. There were exceptions, okay? But almost always we could do that. So that's what Truman wanted. Now, what happened? After World War II, these very imaginative, very courageous people came home from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. They had worked miracles, in Europe and in the Far East Theater. And they came home to well-deserved applause. And then, they said, well, thanks a lot for the applause. Should we hang around here? I mean, do you still need us? Or should we go back to our law firms, our corporations, back to academia? And 1947 is when this all was happening. The Soviets had overrun Eastern Europe. They were threatening Greece and Turkey, and even Italy and France were in some danger. The KGB was all around the world overthrowing governments, and so the question answered itself, of course we need you. Well, okay, that's all fair in love and war, but then some idiot, maybe that's the best word I can, some idiot said, well, we're creating this secret agency for analysis. They're going to have their own clandestine collection capability because they need some spies to get the stuff they can't get from the media. So let's put them in with the analysts. The legislation was changed by one sentence being inserted, and it said, the Director of Central Intelligence shall perform such other duties and tasks from time to time as the President of the United States shall direct. Now, do not blanch from the word. This gives the President of the United States the capability to have his own personal Gestapo. All he needs is the right guy in charge of the intelligence community. And if you don't believe me, just look what George Tenet and George Bush did together. Enhanced interrogation techniques. Some of you may know that comes from a German phrase, verschärfte Vernehmung. What's the translation? Enhanced interrogation techniques. Where was it found? In the Gestapo handbook. What were these techniques? The same ones. So anyhow, that's the background about how CIA had a structural default from structural faults, I'd say, from the very beginning. Why do I mention that? Well, because these swashbuckling guys who were going to overthrow governments were encouraged to do so by my hero, George Kennan. He was largely responsible for this hybrid, okay? So that was 1947, National Security Act. I mean, it created the Defense Department and the Air Force and the National Security Council as well as the CIA, so it was a big deal, okay? Anyhow, that gave these operators the means and the profile to get all the money and to do whatever they were told. And the first thing they were told was, hey, there's this upstart in Iran. The guy was actually elected by the Iranians, I don't know. But he thinks, now get this, he doesn't realize that the oil underneath the sands of Iran, that it belongs to British Petroleum. He thinks that the Iranians should share more of the proceeds from this oil, And so he threatened to, actually did start nationalizing the oil. So what happened? Well, the British have been at this for a long time, you know. I remember what my grandfather told me. So they took the fledgling CIA under its wing, 47 to 3, so this is 6 years into the creation of CIA. They said, now, this is what you do when you have an upstart third world dictator, third world, well, he was actually elected, but you know, it doesn't matter. This is what you have to do. And so, as you all know, MI6 and the CIA overthrew Mossadegh, who was, you know, Time Person of the year before, the only freely elected person in Iranian history, Persian history, and and who did they bring in? They bring in the Shah with his hated secret police, Savak, who were just as bad as the Gestapo, but he was on our side, and he didn't like the Russians. And if you didn't like the Russians, oh man, it's just like, you know, being against terrorists. It doesn't matter what else you do, you know, you have our support. So that was 53. 54, the same thing happened in Guatemala, because the Guatemalans thought maybe United Fruit shouldn't own most of their land, or so much of their land, and maybe the peasants should be. So that was the history of all this, and it's a very sad history. So I just want you to know that the operations directorate has always been separate from the analysis directorate, and it depended on the head of the intelligence community as to whether it did the right thing or the wrong thing, and the president, of course. One fellow that I served under directly, Bill Colby, he must have learned from past mistakes, but he was the most courageous. And when it came out that there was a whole bunch of abuses in the 50s and 60s, he defied Kissinger's admonition not to tell the truth to Congress. He told the truth to Congress. He said, look, I'm a lawyer, you know. I'm a lawyer and I respect the law. This is the law. I'm going to tell Congress about the abuses. And that those abuses included, of course, his predecessor, Richard Helms, having instigated that coup in Chile in 1973. And, you know, Helms was brought up on charges. He was going to be convicted. He pled nolo contendere, okay? I guess that's what they let white-collar people plead to sometimes, you know? And you know what, folks? He went back to CIA headquarters. He was already out of the CIA. Went back to CIA headquarters, and I've never seen such a crowd in our mammoth cafeteria welcoming him, passing around the money, the hat, and the 2,000 or 10,000, whatever he had to pay, was collected like within the first hour. And as I watched this, a couple of us analysts were peeking in from the shadows there. I said, well, you know, this really is two different and distinct agencies. We thought at least I thought what Colby did was exactly good, courageous. Of course, he got canned by Kissinger right after that, and he met a very suspicious death. And that's another story. So that's just by way of saying that the CIA has a kind of a hybrid thing, and that there are the Tom Fingers, but there are also the Richard Helmses and the George Tenets. And every time I go to an airport and have to do all that charade, I think disrespectfully of George Tenet, because he had the power to share more information with the terrorism guy in the White House, Richard Clarke, and he had the power to speak out when he saw that Condoleezza Rice was not taking this seriously. As you know, they didn't talk about Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden until 1 week before 9/11. So let me just kind of finish up here, and I'd like to leave a lot of time for questions. I think that the good news is what I call the Noah principle. I think more of us are even Chris Hedges and others are beginning to realize that we should follow the Noah principle, and that is no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arks. Now, what arks are we going to build? Well, the situation is pretty critical in my view. The powers that be have, roll up the wagons in a circle. And the National Defense Authorization Act is, I think, probably the most revealing thing. This is the one that allows somebody from, what is it called now, Lewis McCord, to come in here and take McGovern to an undisclosed location without charge or anything. But not forever, just until there are no more terrorists, you know. That reversed history since the Civil War, when Southern whites were using the U.S. Army to bring in slavery again, or Reconstruction, whatever they called it. And now they can use the U.S. Army to do this. Now, why did they do that? As I watched that, I couldn't believe it. Here's the Senate. And I saw John McCain and Lindsey Graham and all those people, you know. And I said, well, they're behind it. But you know what? When it came back from the White House, Carl Levin, the chair of that committee, the Armed Services Committee, he was asked by one of the Democratic senators, well, you know, we didn't have the business, we didn't include arresting American citizens for that. How did that get in there? And Levin said, well, the White House put that in there. As if to say, yeah, right. Like, the White House put it in, we couldn't take it out? I mean, since when does, you know, isn't that a telling thing? The White House put it in there. And everybody said, oh, the White House put it in there. So, you know, it was the executive and the Congress. Now, why do you think they wanted to make a law that stringent to use the Army against us, or use the Army? Pardon?
Martial law.
Martial law, yeah, okay. But what were they afraid of? Now, bear in mind, this was 2 years ago, right? What was going on? Pardon? Occupy, you got it, yeah. Yeah, it seemed to me, you know, I was interviewed about this right after it happened, and I'm sitting in this anteroom and saying, now, what's changed over the last several months? And the only thing I could think of was Occupy. And I said, they're afraid of us. You know, up till then we had thousands, but suppose there were tens of thousands. You know, suppose there were 100,000 surrounding the Congress and the White House, and they couldn't get home to their cocktails, their martinis in Georgetown, you know? Who are they going to call? They'll call the park police. Right, the park police weren't outside, you know. They let us camp out there, right in the middle of Washington. Not the court. How about, the Capitol Police? Well, the Capitol Police, with all due respect, they're good at operating those things that you have to walk through to make sure you don't have a weapon on you, but not so much else. District Police. Well, District Police are increasingly aware that they are part of the 99%, okay? And, you know, small wonder that they realize that. So suppose something really happens, suppose the flag goes up, suppose we are surrounded, who can we call on? U.S. Army. The generals, such as there are predominantly creatures of the system. They'll do whatever advances their profile and career. I hate to say that, but it's true. And the people who populate the so-called volunteer army, it's a poverty draft, folks. And that there's a shame on our country. These are mostly people from towns in this country of less than 50,000 people and from the inner city. These are people who have no prospect of a job or of a good education. It's a poverty draft. And they've been ingrained to do what they're told. Witness that terrible WikiLeaks collateral damage or collateral murder thing. I showed that earlier today, and every time I see it, it turns my stomach, because it's not only the Iraqis who are being brutalized, it's been the fellows in those helicopters as well, brutalized. So what are we going to do? Well, I found that in talking around the country, that Americans have a peculiar hesitancy, okay? Now, it's understandable. Who likes to be laughed at, you know? I mean, we don't like to start something that doesn't have a reasonable prospect of success, right? I mean, like, who wants to hear, McGovern, what did you think? What did you think you were doing, turning your back, standing up there when Hillary Clinton was speaking? What was that all about? Well, you know, so you got beat up. What's it, you know? Well, I don't know why I did it, but I thought it was the right thing to do. And, you know, we're not supposed to be worried about being successful, was supposed to be what? Faithful, you know? The good is worth doing because it's good. And if we're all worried about, you know, whether we're going to achieve success, we ain't going to do nothing. It's much, you know, it's like what Camus said, you know, you can always remain silent, and that's, of course, what the Germans did in the 30s. So the other thing, when I got beat up by the goons at Hillary Clinton, this was at George Washington University that folks who don't know, about 3 years ago, all I did was, well, maybe I just explain in my own defense. I spent not a lot of time, but I spent some time in the Soviet Union, and there used to be, when a Soviet leader made a speech, there would be stormy applause, you know, and in Pravda the next day, it would be, every third paragraph would say, "Бурные аплодисменты, все стоят." Stormy applause, everyone stands, right? Well, Hillary Clinton walks into this lecture hall, not lecture hall, this big auditorium at GW University. I got somebody to get me an invitation to it. And stormy applause, everyone stands, okay? I'm thinking, oh, бурные аплодисменты, все стоят. And then the president of George Washington University comes in. I'll tell you, he made her out to be, you know, Mother Teresa, okay? And so I'm holding my nose there and I say, McGovern, what are you going to do? Luckily, I had my Veterans for Peace shirt on. So there was plenty of time. They stood for about 4 minutes, so I took off my outer shirt and I put my Veterans for Peace shirt on. I turned my back and I just stood. And all she could see, and she was as close as that camera there, all she could see was veteransforpeace.org, you know? But what the cameras could see was me standing there, you know, as she's talking right behind me, and they could see Veterans for Peace, the whole logo here, okay? And I said, you know, I have done this before actually in church. I'm a Catholic, and I don't like the fact that, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a Catholic, and I don't like the fact that women are subordinated, and I couldn't just sit where I used to sit and kneel and whatever, you know. So I used to stand for the service. I did that for 4.5 years in my parish. I finally had to leave, but anyhow, so I'm fixing, you know, I did what I did then at Holy Trinity. I looked right at the wall, and I picked up a little piece on the wall, and 2 minutes, man, everything's, you know, this is going to work, this will be good. And the cameras, you know, get me, you know. And I hear Hillary Clinton talking about the necessity to have freedom of expression. It's really important, you know, in Iran, you know. And she doesn't miss a syllable. She just keeps going on. Then all of a sudden I see this guy come down with, he looked like a Redskins reject, you know, about 300 pounds. He comes down with just a suit on. And he's coming down there and says, oh, I don't know what's going to happen now. Before I could figure out what happened, some guy grabs me from the back. They lift me up, and they carry me over the 3 women between me and the aisle, take me out, bang my head against the door frame on the way out, and did other brutal things. Meanwhile, Hillary doesn't miss a beat, okay? Not a syllable. And it's all recorded, you know, it's kind of interesting. Some of the footage did get out. Now, why do I say this? Well, I say this because I see some people around here that have the same color hair I do. And when that happened to me, the first report came out of Fox News. And it was pretty, you know, so-so. It said, an elderly gentleman. That hurt, you know. An elderly gentleman was thought to have a sign secreted beneath the seat, or it was felt that he might be willing to shout something out at the Secretary of State, and so he was escorted out of the theater. Right? Okay, so right, escorted out of the theater, right? But when the word got out that when the pictures came out, what happened to me, I mean, people care about old people getting beat up, and that's why I mentioned this. You know, young people, I have it coming. You know, young people, I can take it. But 71-year-old people, you know, I'm even older now, if you can believe it, you know. We have an advantage. And I say this not jocularly. I say this in real seriousness. We have an advantage. People care if we get beat up. And I don't think they're going to kill us. But if you're willing to take a stand on these things, you're going to get a lot more reaction, a lot more resonance by virtue of you being an old guy like me. And when one of my Veterans for Peace added, yeah, and he's got cancer. Luckily, I had just gotten into remission. But, oh man, Hillary Clinton had over 500,000 emails and telephone calls just by virtue of the 71 years old. The cancer brought it up to 800,000. So I kid you not. We can kind of, have our principles, okay? And we can stand on our principles. But if there's nothing for which you're willing to suffer for those principles, and I don't mean necessarily physically, but if you're not willing to put those principles into play where you could get hurt, where your compassion would mean, actually suffering with or suffering because, look what Ed Snowden did, then your principles, they're really nice to have, aren't they? But I don't know, there's something lacking there, it seems to me. The prospect of success, I think we've dealt with that. Are there enough of us? Cesar Chavez used to always say, there are enough of us. But without action, nothing's going to happen. Op-eds are really nice, speeches are really nice, but if you don't get out there, nothing's going to happen. And it's getting kind of late. And I think that probably the next year or two are going to be key. And so I think we need to play a role. We have to recognize our responsibility. We have to be prophetic. We have to go back to the vision of the founders. I've learned a little bit about the prophets at this place where I work at the Ecumenical Church of the Savior. And I just want to see how biblically literate this crowd is. Okay, Isaiah. Who knows that Isaiah walked around for at least 2 years stark naked? Raise your hand. Whoa, oh, good, all right, there are a couple people here, all right. Now, it's right in the Bible, okay? Now, the question is, what was he doing? Now, the smart exegetes, the people who study really hard, said, well, it's not clear. And they say this without any humor, Usually exegetes don't have a lot of humor, and they say, well, it's not clear that he was always naked, just during liturgical services. That may be good exegesis, but it doesn't get the man off the hook, right? So what was he saying? What I think he was saying is, look, I'm stripped of my garments here, right? And you say, oh, isn't that awful? Isn't that awful? You are stripped of the vision with which Yahweh blessed you, a vision of justice and shalom, and that is far worse than being physically naked. I don't think we're stripped of that vision, but I think it's kind of needs repair and needs some courage, and needs it quickly. Martin Luther King famously said, there is such a thing as too late. There is such a thing as too late. And I'll finish just by quoting a German that you may not have heard of. He was a contemporary of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran minister who tried to waken up the church there and couldn't. His name was Albrecht Haushofer, and he was a Geolog. He was a geologist at the University of Berlin, and he had tenure. And some of you may not know what tenure means, but it means a lot. It meant a lot in Berlin, and it means a lot around here now. I don't have to tell some of you. Now, how did he get tenure? By keeping his mouth shut. So, he also had a conscience. And as he watched his Jewish friends and other friends being wrapped up, sent away, he gathered a following around himself and spoke out against what was going on, okay? And it was really quite significant that they saw this fellow finally speaking out. And so he was wrapped up by the Gestapo and put in another prison, separate from Bonhoeffer. And he was condemned to be shot. Bonhoeffer was hanged. Those were the two executions that they used. But the Germans, being very meticulous, they insisted that you sign a confession before they would shoot you or hang you, okay? Now, Haushofer wasn't about to do that, So he refused to do it, and as the Allies approached, they shot him and fell down. And as they picked him up, out of his pocket fell a little settle. little piece of paper, you know, and on it, the title was Schuld, guilt, right? Okay, and it was his confession, and it was written in the form of a sonnet. And how many have German here? Yeah, okay, good. Some have. Okay. Well, it's not very long, but what it said was, Schuld. Doch bin ich schuldig, aber anders als ihr denkt. Yeah, I'm guilty, but it's not what you're thinking. Right? Ich musste früher meine Pflicht erkennen. I should have früher, earlier, recognized my duty. Ich musste schärfer Unheil nennen. I should have schärfer, more sharply called Unheil, evil. Mein Urteil habe ich zu lang gelenkt. I put off my judgment far too long. Ich habe gewarnt, I did warn, as you know, we know he did warn, aber nicht genug. Enough. Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar, clear, claro. There's no comparative in German for klar is klar. Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar. Und heute weiß ich, was ich schuldig war. And today I recognize what I was guilty of. So, there is such a thing as too late. A lot of you recognize that and are out there doing your thing already. But we need all of us in this battle. And we need to be able to stick our necks out. And the last thing I'll say is that I do not have anything against necks. I've been accused of having a lot against necks, but I think necks are very nice. They're convenient connections between head and torso. I hate to be without a neck, all right? But if there is nothing for which you will risk that neck, then it becomes your idol, okay? And necks are not deserving of idol worship. So, I don't have to tell most of you this, but I'll say it anyway. Be willing to stick your necks out. Be willing to do whatever is necessary to demonstrate that we want to be loyal to our founder's vision. And if we have to strip ourselves naked, well, that's one thing, but we probably won't have to do that. Whatever we need to do, we do it without worrying about whether it's going to be successful or not. But let's just try to do the good because it's worth doing, and leave the rest in other hands, in the hands of the coming generation. And I know that I can be with my 9 grandchildren in a much more comfortable way if I know that I'm doing what I can to make their future a little better. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope that we could just... I saw you in film. What's your name? I forget.
Eric will be in the back for anyone who needs their
Dorley?
Parking stamp. But why don't you just stand up and wiggle for a second, and then we'll come back for Q&A, and you can just line up at the stand there.
We did a thing with your T-shirt when Candy Rice was speaking at the
did you?
here.
Good.
She's now a world celebrity.
Yeah, well, with good reason. Yeah, I saw you and Rich too. And weren't you both wrapped up together?
For those who are interested, Ray will be preaching here on Sunday at 10:30, and I do want to emphasize that he'll be preaching here. It's not a political talk, but it is a prophetic talk in the Christian Judeo.
Give me your email address and your name and what you want, and I'll send it to you.
I changed that.
Pardon? Right. I will.
Take the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to bug your private
You're the guy from
conversation.
We
NSA,
will
right?
make sure he's fully clothed.
That's the guy from NSA.
So Mike, go ahead. Thank you. You can come back together and we'll do some Q&A for a bit.
Great. So I'm very grateful that you're going to give the keynote at the annual dinner of the Coffee Strong operation.
Me too.
Pro-soldier, anti-war. I'm just wondering what a president gets every morning in terms of a security statement and what impact you imagine that has on a president coming in as a community organizer from Chicago.
Well, it depends on the president and his experience or lack thereof, but I can speak to my own experience, and it was the heyday of that kind of briefing, because when Ronald Reagan was elected to be president, we went right out to Pacific Palisades with the President's Daily Brief, with the approval of Admiral Turner, our director, and Jimmy Carter, our president, and gave him the same treatment that we gave Carter and well, the Carter White House, with one difference. Since Brzezinski knew all the answers, just like Kissinger before him, we never set foot in the White House to say hello to the president or brief him personally. They all took the PDB and marked it up and said, don't worry about this one. This one, this is foolish and all that kind of stuff. But with Reagan, we got a foot in the door right off the bat. We showed up, two of us. It wasn't me, but two colleagues. And they said, PDB, President's Daily Brief, and the Secret Service. What are you talking about? We don't know about that. You haven't been heard? You haven't heard about that? Well, just then, fortuitously, Ronald Reagan comes down the stairs with his bathrobe on. So what's going on here? PDB, CIA briefing, sir. Oh, come on in, come on in. So that's how it happened. And he liked the treatment 6 mornings a week. There was one guy out there for 2 weeks, the next one come out the next 2 weeks. And by the time he came to Washington, it was judged to be a real success, and he really liked it. So George H.W. Bush, his vice president, said, well, okay, now, Mr. President, how do you want to set it up now? I think that I should get one-on-one treatment too, as vice president, and maybe the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, but let's keep it to that because these are, very delicate, very sensitive things. And Reagan said, that's a good idea, except I think it's kind of early for me, and so why don't you all get the one-on-one, and come see me about 11:30 and tell me what you should worry about. So the good news was we went one-on-one with the very top national security people in the whole government every morning, 6 days a week, okay? Sort of not so good news is that we very seldom got to see the president personally, but giving those people these briefings and having them being able to compare notes with one another, it saved the president an awful lot of back and forth, so they kind of knew what each one had been told, and they were able to brief the president at 11:30 in a much more efficient way. So it was the heyday of, and it was one-on-one, senior analysts were respected enough and trusted enough to do that. And there were times when I knew that my superiors were lying about whether the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would ever collapse, whether Gorbachev was the real deal. And I knew the trustworthy people who had been through Soviet analysis with me, and when we saw Gorbachev, we realized he was the real deal. And so in briefing Secretary Shultz, I told him what the people I trust felt about it, which put me at odds with Bill Casey, the director, and Bobby Gates, who once worked for me as a young analyst, who was the head of the CIA, head of analysis at the time. So it was, that was irregular. It shouldn't have been necessary, but it was possible to speak truth to power one-on-one. Now, what did George W. Bush do? As soon as he heard that briefers were going down, and not George W. Bush, but George Tenet, when briefers go down early in the morning for FaceTime with the president, he hitched a ride. Can I come with you? And the briefer should have said, no, sir, thanks very much, but we don't need the director looking over our shoulder. Of course, nobody said that. So, put yourself in that position. President George W. Bush says, all right, tell us about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, honest analyst, it's a crock, Mr. President, it's a crock. It's a neocon fable. We destroyed all of them after the first war. We don't think there are any left, and they're certainly not working on any nuclear weapon. Well, he's going to say that with George Tenet, the fawning sycophant, standing right behind him? Well, I think I would have said it anyway, but I wouldn't be briefing the next day. So it's sort of a trade-off. So even that got corrupted because, you know, when the party line is this and you know the truth is that, you have some difficult choices to make. And I dare say most people kind of bend with the wind. I'm sorry to be so long-winded. Please, next question.
I just have two quick questions.
Sure.
It just came out that Arafat was found to have his body have polonium in it.
Polonium.
I'd like to know who you suspect was the one. Was it our government or some other government?
Mm-hmm.
And then you were with the Johnson administration in August of 1967.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us anything about the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty that you're familiar with? And
Sure,
why Congress has refused to bring that case to an investigation before these guys die?
Okay, sure. I don't know. It's sort of a no-brainer. The usual suspect would be Israel. They have the capability, and you know, the circumstances clearly point in that direction. He got sick there when he was in Ramallah, and we kind of know. It's no surprise to me that those were the results. They're not final yet, I understand, but it's, you know, and whether George Bush knew about it or not, probably not, but the Israelis rightly would have judged that George Bush would be very happy to get rid of Arafat. Now, the USS Liberty, let me just ask, how many people know about the USS Liberty incident? Oh, thank God, thank God. When Mearsheimer and Waltz finally got their piece out, they had to go to London to the London Review of Books. That was the first place that it appeared. They had a contract with the Atlantic to publish it, but when the Atlantic saw the draft, they said, oh gosh, you know, we can't publish something. This would get us in trouble with the APAC, with the Israel lobby. So anyhow, after they published that, I was on a plane going to Missouri. And so I read it, and man, I thought it was great, you know. And I get off the plane, and I'm speaking in this church hall about this size, but it was full, about 300 people. And after it was, toward the end, somebody said, well, what did you think of Mearsheimer and Walt's book or article? And I said, thanks for asking. I have just read it. I think it's great, but I have one big question. I said, what's that? I said, well, the whole thrust of the book is to show the influence of the Israel lobby, and they're right on about that. But why did they not include the best example that Israel can get away literally with murder, murdering our naval officers, and get away with that? And I've since asked, which one was it, Mearsheimer, I guess. He said, well, we didn't want to lay it on too thick, you know, well, hello. So then I looked out at this audience, and that's what, sorry to be so long-winded, but I said, how many people know? Well, so what happened was, so I answered that. I said, you know, I just couldn't understand why they didn't use the USS Liberty incident. And then I looked at these blank faces. And I said, now, how many of you have heard about the USS Liberty, what happened to it on June 8th, 1967? 3 hands. One here, one in the middle, one in the back. And so I picked the guy nearest. I said, sir, can you tell us how you know about that? Yes. Bryce Lockwood, U.S. Marine Corps, member of the USS Liberty crew. Yeah, this is in Springfield, Missouri. So I said, Mr. Lockwood, could you come up here and share what happened? He said, sir, I've not been able to do that, but I think I'd like to try tonight. Yeah. And he came up and he gave 10 minutes of rendition of what it was like, what he went through. He was the commanding Marine of all the Marines who are working on the intercept material. And it fell to him to dig out the bodies from where the torpedo came in. So that sensitized me to the problem here. Nobody knows about the USS Liberty. And so when I talked up in Maine earlier this year, I asked the same question. And it was an audience much like this, but only about 5 of maybe 200 raised their hands. So it's good that you guys know about it, and isn't it proof positive that the Israelis think they can get away with murder and have, and our Congress, and you know, when they finally decided to give the commander of that ship the Medal of Honor, you know what, the State Department asked the Israeli ambassador, you wouldn't take offense if we give him, would you believe it? You won't take offense if we, well, we prefer you not, but, so they did it, not in the White House, but in the Navy Yard on the Anacostia River, where you have to hold your nose before you go there. So that's how bad it was, okay? And I've been with the USS Liberty crew, the ones that survived, obviously, and I had the incredible experience of honoring a guy named Terry Halbardier, who is a young Texan, 19 at the time, seaman, who volunteered to go across the napalm-strewn deck and try to connect a wire with an antenna that hadn't been used. It hadn't been used, and so the Israelis didn't know it was there. They destroyed all the other antennae right away. And the captain said, well, this is pretty dangerous. He said, yeah, I want to do it. I can do that. I can do lots of stuff with bail and wire, you know? Well, he did, and they got an SOS out, okay? The Israelis intercepted the SOS. They broke off the attack as soon as they realized that the USS America, USS Saratoga were sending fighter bombers to deal with whoever was attacking a US Navy ship. And what happened then?
Lyndon Johnson called him.
That's right.
Yes, he said he didn't give a damn if the ship sank,
Yeah.
but he wouldn't embarrass our ally,
Yeah.
Israel.
So you guys know the story. What happened was the commander of the Sixth Fleet? Yeah, Sixth Fleet.
Yeah, the Mediterranean.
He got this telephone call, break off the attack. Who's this? Secretary McNamara. And to his credit, he said, well, you know, my forces are under attack. I'm going to have to speak to your supervisor. You know, some of these Navy guys have some guts, you know. Lyndon Johnson's on the other line. He says, I want you to call those folks back. You call them right away. We don't want to embarrass our ally. Admiral Geis saluted, called them back. But luckily, the Israelis had gotten the message that they were coming, and they got out of Dodge. The ship limped back to Malta under its own power, and let's see, how many people were killed? 37? 34.
171 wounded.
And 171 wounded, okay? And those people, you want to talk about PTSD? I'll tell you what PTSD looks like.
Yeah, tell him.
They were told not to talk to their wives, to their children, to their fellow crew people about it ever, under pain of court-martial, okay? And sharing, Terry Halbardier got a medal from a congressman in the Central Valley of California. I went out to that ceremony. It was so wonderful to get that recognition, okay? This is the guy that connected the cable, guy from Texas, okay? Now, I had lunch with those guys, and they told me what it was like. And you want to see PTSD like in spades, you put people in that kind of position where they can't even acknowledge what happened to them. People dug out the bodies from where the torpedo went in. And so, you know, that's a concrete example, and people need to know that, and I'm glad you mentioned it. Sorry to be so long-winded, but for those who you hadn't had the story, there's a website, isn't there, ussliberty.org or something like that. You can learn a lot about it. It's not a happy story, but it's one that we have to know. Now, I have to say that the president faced down Israeli pressure to do to Syria what we did to Iraq. And so there are glimmers of hope here that the lobby doesn't reign completely supreme. The right thing happened. You know, peace broke out on Syria. And just look at the people who are in high dudgeon because peace broke out, and you'll see the real neocons and the people that really wanted this Sunni Shia thing to continue indefinitely, because who profits from that?
Israel.
Israel. And not only in Syria, but Sunni Shia throughout that whole area. So there is progress, and I'm happy to say that, but we've got a really long way to go. Please.
So briefly, James Ennis, crew member of the Liberty, lives just east of here in Woodinville.
Wow.
He wrote Assault on the Liberty.
Right.
And of course, you're going to Olympia, that's where Rachel Corrie came from, another person murdered by the Israelis.
Right.
And when they get away with it, and it never reaches the light of official inquiry. So a related question, is it the Israeli tail that wags the American dog, or is it the American dog that wags the Israeli tail? Please comment on the special relationship between the U.S. government and the Israeli government.
Well, this is a relationship that George Washington himself warned against, right? Passionate attachment of one country to another on the misbegotten notion that the interests of each are identical, okay? Now, you know, he talked about entangling alliances, and it was his farewell speech, you know? And now, at the time, everybody wanted to go onto the side of France because of what the British had done to us, and you know, what ingrates we are. The French pull our potatoes out of the fire. You know, why don't we help them? And he was, you know, wise enough to say, no, this is really crazy stuff. You don't get involved unless your interests are identical. I think maybe FDR, he judged that correctly. So, but, you know, I'll say a word about Rachel Corrie, you know. I've met Craig and Cindy many years ago, like 8 or 9 years ago, and we were having this long brunch. It was great down in Olympia. And I saw that Craig had on a bracelet, and he saw that I had one on and was orange, and he said, "What's that, Ray?" I said, "Well, that's about torture. We're wearing that in Washington now, you know, orange torture." I said, "What's that green one?" He said, "Well, that's," well, he didn't say anything, he took it off, and he said, "Read it," and it says, Rachel Corrie, April 10, 1979, March 16, 2003. He says, "Would you like it?" I said, "Well, yes, of course I would. Do you have others?" He said, "Yeah, we have others." I've been wearing that since. Now, I've gone through about 5 of them, you know. And last time he was in Washington, just 3 weeks ago, he brought me like 10 of them that will last me the next, hopefully, 10 years. I had been wearing one that was stapled together for a whole year. I was able to take a shower with it, don't worry about that. But so anyhow, this, you know, I look at this and I say, well, you know, there's one of those prophets. There's one of those people who wasn't worried about whether she'd be successful, you know. There's a real gutsy young lady that if I have a reminder about what she did, well, you know, getting beat up by the GW police or whoever it was, you know, that's not as bad as getting run over by an Israeli tank, right? And then getting backed over just to make sure your back is broken. So, you know, there are these little, artifacts or something that are useful to me to remind me that, you know, there are pretty courageous people around still today. You don't have to be a saint from the Middle Ages. And so the Corries are special to me, and I'm going to see them just tomorrow. I'm going to be talking down Evergreen and doing a thing in Olympia as well. Sorry.
First, I have to question your credibility, because 3 times you said you're sorry for talking too long. I'm not sure of that.
Well, yeah, I'm Irish, so I have this, you know, kind of thing about anger and about talking too much. Yeah.
I'm only a little Irish, so I'll try and be quick. I grew up in Monterey, California, when Leon Panetta ran for Congress. Several of the most prominent Republican lawyers in town announced their support of him, and the county chairman of the Republican Party criticized them. And they said, "Oh, you don't understand. This isn't Democrats and Republicans. This is Leon. He's smarter than all of us, and he works harder than all of us, and he's more honest than anyone we've ever met." So Leon was the same in Congress, smarter and harder working and more honest. And then in the CIA and in the Pentagon, he looked an awful lot like just another government bureaucrat. I think that means that that's final proof that nobody and nothing can stand up against the machine, and that if we want to make changes, it doesn't matter so much who we put in, it matters how we change America's culture so that it will no longer support such a machine. Your comments?
Well, that's a profound observation. All I can say is that I've been wrong several times over the last 12 years when I've been doing this, but never wronger than when I diagnosed Leon Panetta as a guy who was going to save the intelligence apparatus. I mean, look, he was trained by Jesuits, Santa Clara Law School. He must have this ethos of telling the truth. He must, he criticized torture a year before he was named, Never have I been wronger. What did he become? He became the agency's lawyer. He left the torturers, the kidnappers, the secret wardens at these prisons in place, awarded them stuff, and he acted as the interface between them and Congress, defending them at every turn. And in the process, when he became Secretary of Defense, he was a traitor to the Constitution of the United States. Why do I say that? Well, that senator from Alabama, what's his name? He's on a Judiciary Committee. He's a lawyer, and he was asking Panetta, now you didn't so much as tell us about Libya. You thought that you could just make a war on your own. Don't you know that Congress is given the power to declare war or authorize war in the first article of the Constitution? Panetta, the president's going to do what's necessary to defend our country, period. Yes, but doesn't it need to be authorized or at least discussed with the Congress? The president has every right to do what he has to do to defend our country, and he's going to do it. Is that clear? Now, who's sitting next to him but General Dempsey? Now, General Dempsey is the real deal. He knows what the Constitution says, and it was largely Dempsey who prevented war with Syria. And I'll just say a quick word about that because it's really necessary for people to understand. It's not just conjecture. On Friday afternoon, August 30, John Kerry got up and said 35 times, we know Bashar al-Assad has leveled those chemical attacks on, blah, 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 blah. And the president said that was the red line. We know, blah, blah. Everyone thought, including me, that when the president got up in the Rose Garden the next afternoon, he would say, even as we speak, cruise missiles are flying into, blah, 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 What happened? What changed his mind? The Israelis had already been warned that we were going to attack the cruise missiles, because they had to be warned. They want to put up their own defenses. And we know that because the Israelis have admitted that. So what happened? Well, the clue is in what the president said in the Rose Garden. What did he say? Do you remember? He said, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has told me that there's no time sensitivity to this operation. Our forces are in place, but we can do it today, we can do it tomorrow, we could do it next week, we could do it next month. So I'm going to seek authorization from the Congress. Whoa. That's not the way things was going down. Now, he said that, and then the next day, if more proof were needed, John McCain and Lindsey Graham descend on the White House, do you remember? In high dudgeon, and they're railing, they come out into the little driveway there, and the press says, well, what's going on? Well, that chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has put the kibosh on this whole thing. We had, how are we going to defend, blah, 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 blah. So, finally, the way I diagnose it, and you can take it for what it's worth, Dempsey went to the president and said, look, Mr. President, we know that you really like those young, tough guys in the White House who never served, and those new, tough young gals you got there, they're really great people, what Samantha so-and-so and Susan Rice, we know that you like those guys, but they don't know diddly about war. And neither does John Kerry, with all due respect. Running boats up against up at the Mekong doesn't qualify you to talk about the possibility of a unbelievably small strike against Syria, which will have no consequences. And so, Mr. President, we know about war. And I just want to tell you that when the press comes, as they inevitably will, and say, General Dempsey, why did you have to do that now? Why couldn't you wait until the UN inspectors come back and report? I'm going to have to say, beats the hell out of me, go ask the president. Now, why do I think Dempsey was capable of that? Well, because when our president was too afraid of the Israel lobby to tell Netanyahu this time last year not to provoke the Iranians into some sort of hostilities before the election. Remember, there was an election last year, okay? He sent Panetta, and he sent Hillary Clinton, and he sent his national security advisor, and he sent the chairman. He sent everybody there to to ask Bibi Netanyahu, please, pretty please, not before the election. After the election, we'll talk about it some more, but not before the election, okay? And what did Netanyahu do? We have this sign in the Bronx, something maybe. So I was deathly afraid that that Netanyahu would do it unless the president himself spoke out publicly. He didn't. Who spoke out? Anybody remember? Dempsey, right? Yeah. In London on the 30th of August. Interesting that it was also the 30th of August. Dempsey speaks out and he says this, quote, "I don't want to be complicit if the Israelis attack Iran," end quote. Whoa! Now, did he have the president's permission to say that? I'm sure he did. I mean, even chairmen of the Joint Chiefs don't go off on their own tangent. But what he said to Obama was, look, somebody's got to say it. I realize you got political problems. You got the lobby to contend. I don't, but the stakes are very high, Mr. President. This is what I'm going to say in London, okay? And he said, okay. So that's the kind of Dempsey we have. Now, he's atypical in terms of a general that's, the generals get to be generals because other generals think they're safe and, they get promoted in a pretty corrupt way. But Dempsey is the real deal. And so that's a real hope on the horizon here, because I think he was at least, I think he was usually responsible for changing the president's mind, and, peace broke out for once. There are times when we can rejoice about these things. I had real trouble persuading my colleagues in veteran intelligence professionals who said, hey, we won this one, peace has broken out. Well, yeah, but blah, blah, blah. Well, let's rejoice when we have small victories. They come few and far between. This was a biggie. Yes, I won't apologize for carrying on so long.
I guess the NSA has a cozy relationship with their
NSA has, I'm sorry?
A cozy relationship with the subcontractors.
Yes.
And also, Snowden pointed out that we share raw intelligence with the Israelis. And so I was thinking that maybe the Israelis would get information on our politicians and use that information to blackmail them in the future. And will even give the Israeli lobby even more power. And so what do you think of that? And then my second question is...
well, let me answer that before I forget. This has come out. It's even come out that the raw intelligence has been shared with the Israelis. And that means us, the Israelis have information on us. So yeah, that's a real worry. And, there are a lot of things like that in this relationship.
Then my second question is, what do you think was the motivation of the Liberty attack? Do you think it was a false flag? And my another question is, do you think there's going to be a false flag attack after Assad gets his weapons removed? Mm-hmm. Okay, we're referring to the Liberty in that second question? Or? No. What I think is that after Assad gets rid of his weapons, the so-called rebels are going to have a false flag, and it's going to provoke a war.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's hard to know. It's a can of worms what's going to happen in Syria. But what I do know is that there's more hope now that with the Russians and us talking together, you know, we worked out this agreement. Putin deserves Kerry deserves no credit. Apparently Obama had to go behind Kerry's back and work this thing out with Putin. Look at what Kerry said there in London, coming back. You know, he did his press conference, and then some correspondent came up and asked an unscheduled question. Is there nothing Assad can do to avoid getting attacked by you? And remember Kerry's response? Well, I suppose he could destroy all his nuclear weapons, but that ain't gonna happen. That will never happen, you know, okay? Well, his press spokesman, just 1 hour later, she says, well, that was just a rhetorical flourish, you know. Well, I mean, I think you have to take some things at their face value. He didn't want that, and he didn't do his job in trying to figure that out with Lavrov, okay? But the president did, meeting with Putin twice in Belfast and also in St. Petersburg. And so it was just, you know, a terrible, inconvenient remark by Kerry to be so out of sync with what was really going on, because as you know, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, immediately said, well, we can do that, you know, yeah, we can work that out. And then 2 hours later, the Syrian foreign minister said, yeah, we can destroy all those weapons, you know. And so they threw a lifeline to Obama, and to his credit, you know, he's under a lot of pressure not to take that kind of lifeline. He took it, and so peace broke out. Rejoice, and again I say, rejoice. You know? So is that, yeah, thanks for, does that do it?
You missed the second.
The second question was, what do you think was the motivation behind the Liberty attack?
Oh, the Liberty. Okay, good. I thought, yeah. Well, you know, no one knows for sure, and that's what the most important thing here is, that the fact is very clear. Nobody disputes the fact. The Israelis did it, and they did it deliberately. We have the intercepted messages, but there's an American flag on that ship. Hit it. Follow your instructions, okay? So they did it deliberately. Now, why? That's not so clear, okay? Were the Israelis thinking that they could pretend that was an Egyptian or a Soviet thing and try to get us involved more directly in the war? More likely, the Israelis wanted to go up on the Golan the next day, and we had told them, no, now you did a really good job destroying the Egyptian and Syrian, Jordan. Don't go up on the Golan. We say again, don't go up on the Golan. Well, they had no way of going up on the Golan without communicating with their forces, and there was no way that the Liberty wouldn't pick up those communications. So that's one theory. Makes some sense to me that they didn't want to, you know, they don't like to ask permission. They would rather ask forgiveness. They were going up the Golan. They didn't want the president or anybody to say, don't do it. And so they could do that if they destroyed the Liberty.
But why would Johnson, with all the submission to them, tell them don't do it?
Mm-hmm.
If you follow your logic, you find that it doesn't make sense, actually.
That
they were going to do whatever they want, regardless of what Johnson does say.
Well, yeah, but it's easier if the U.S. doesn't know until after the fact. That's all I'm saying. The other thing, what was the other explanation?
Possible getting the Russians and the Americans.
Yeah, getting the Russians and the Americans together at loggerheads, just getting the U.S. more deeply involved. It might have been a combination of all those things, but again, the important thing is it happened. It was deliberate, and you know, this combination of explanations is probably closest to the truth. Please.
Yeah, I admit to a kind of obsession regarding the first 9/11 of 1973.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, talk in the mic closely.
Okay. The other 9/11, 1973, masterminded by Kissinger, a man who probably his favorite word is linkage. Mm. And he also, his big bloody hand was involved in East Timor, as you also know, and also Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. And I think by common sense definitions, he can be called a serial mass murderer and therefore a psychopath My question, and he's also regarded as a sage. So my question is, naive as it is, what is it that protects him? Why is now I'm babbling.
No, this is a really good question. It's the establishment. You know, he's anointed as some sort of sage, as you say, by the establishment. The establishment controls the press. And so here's Henry Kissinger giving out awards and getting awards still for being a mass murderer. You're right. So that just points up how I haven't said this yet tonight, but I always try to say it, that 50 years in Washington allows you to see a lot of change, right? Well, there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes in significance, and that is that we no longer have, in any real sense, a free media. That's big, folks. The Fourth Estate is dead, okay? The good news, what's the good news? Yeah, there's a Fifth Estate. A Fifth Estate, I don't know where it is, but it comes down into my computer, right? And there's Julian Assange. And there's lots of stuff available. And this is what we need to do. We need to encourage young people to figure out a way to make old people like me not afraid of breaking the computers. You know, my kids keep telling me, look, you can't break it. You can do, it won't break like the toys you had when you were a kid. And once you know that, then all you need to know is maybe 2 or 3 strokes to get onto a reputable website, and you can be better informed and more quickly informed than ever before. So we need the younger generation, and there are some here, to help us out on that. But we have to also be humble enough to, risk making a fool of ourselves and just kind of learning like kids learn, because old people can learn too, I think. Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah. Next.
Get closer.
Get real close to it. You have to really kind of swallow it.
I have a lot to say, but I want to try to keep it brief.
Go closer.
I think one of the reasons why people get protected is not just, the blame isn't just about the establishment. The blame also lies in us. It's called implied or silent consent, when we don't speak up. And so they take that as a sign to do whatever because we don't really care about what happens to us. I also appreciate this kind of forum and you speaking out because we're sharing information and we're sharing truth the way Snowden does, his way. And I also would like to say that while this is a focus on the problems out there are things that are existing here in our own city that we need to see, that everything that's playing out on the world stage is playing here in Seattle. And I wonder, I'm asking you, what do you know about smart grids and smart meters and...
What do I know about what?
Smart grid and smart meters and how that plays in with security.
Yeah. Well, I have some personal experience with these smart meters. You mean the electrical meters that they put on the thing? Yeah. My wife has something that's diagnosed as Lyme disease, but she had been sleeping just above the smart meter ever since it came in. And there's something having to do with that emissions that I sleep in that room now, and she's still recovering from this. So all that's a personal kind of anecdote. I don't know whether that is widely applicable, but these guys do lots of stuff they don't tell us about. I often wonder what these clouds up there, these artificial clouds, what that's all about, So yeah, you're right. We got to insist to know. There are a lot of people here who are doing that. I know. So we're preaching to the choir, but we have to preach to the unchoir as well and tell them, look, you deserve to know about these things. And if your representatives won't tell you, well, then you raise hell. You sit in. You get arrested, or maybe you don't have too much gray hair, so maybe you don't want to get beat up yet, but you risk you stick your neck out just to make sure that the First Amendment that our founders gave us is observed.
Yeah, the reason I bring that out is because it has security, health, and financial implications. The same way that the war out there is still the war in here.
Yeah.
And citizens are being warred upon And the only way we can protect ourselves is to really, after this session, go home and research what you can, because it's the only way you can save each other.
Yeah, we have sort of in our church an ethos, which is a little different. And that is you create a little group, like 3, 4, 5, 6 at the top. You know, a really little group, people that look at the world like you do, you feel simpatico with, and you meet every week. Okay, every week, okay? And you will be amazed at what that synergy produces. There will be ideas that rise out of that synergy that none of you, not one of you, would have thought of by yourself. And when one of those ideas comes out, and it's kind of given, well, yeah, why did we think of that before? Yeah, we'll support you on that. Then you have the support of a small community, and then you have something called accountability, okay? Because if you say, I'm going to see my congressman on Thursday, you know that the next meeting, your friends will say, well, how did that go, you know? And so there's both. There's the support in a small community, and there's the accountability that comes of being close to it. And that only comes when you meet every week, and when you have a real trust. The only requirement is that there has to be at least one woman in these circles, because I find out that the women in this country have all the guts. Look at Code Pink, look at Rachel Corrie, look at the raging grannies up there in New York. Where are the raging grandpas? That's what I'd like to know, you know? I talked to the raging, they asked me to talk to them in New York, and I asked that question at the end. I said, anybody wants to be a raging grandpa? I'm willing to join that. And how many people came up? 1. So I guess, you know, we've got to watch football and stuff like that. I have nothing against football. Well, I guess I do have to, but, you know, we should, yeah.
Could you just all permit me to just do 2 quick?
Well, no, one.
That's it.
No, one. He's been standing. No,
Right.
you talk to Ray at the end.
Right.
I want you to have the last questions. No, at the end.
We got one more. Yeah. We can talk later.
Yeah, I don't know how brief you can make it, but I'm very curious about 9/11.
Uh-huh.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know.
Oh, we gotta go now.
No, well, 9/11 is, you know, the most important thing that happened in the last generation. So, you know, it's a good thing to raise it. And I don't shy away from telling you where I stand on that. The official explanation is a whole bunch of lies. Now, you don't have to believe me on that. The guys that ran the commission, Hamilton and Kane, you know, up there in Jersey, distinguished governor of New Jersey previous. I mean, they were completely out of their depth. I remember when Kane was nominated to be the chair, and they said, well, now, how are you going to do your business of being president of your university, Drew University in New Jersey, and do this job? Oh, no problem. I'll come down once a week, and I'll, that's what he said, you know. And he found out later that, you know, it took 3 hours to get through security, you know, and to get access to this information. Then he wasn't allowed to take any notes, and then, you know, he had to take the metro liner back up to Princeton so to get back to, hello, that's, you know, that's how lightly he took his task. And he just sort of complained, you know, they're really not letting me see much stuff, but what he should have done, and what he could have done, is say, look, I want 3 security officers detailed to me in my study at Drew University. I want a safe. I want to keep all that stuff there. I want to be able to review it in the evening. And before I come down to Washington, I want this rigmarole and all that stuff. He didn't do that. Why didn't he do it? Because he's an establishment guy, right? And Hamilton, that faux Democrat who's been covering up everything since Iran-Contra, you know. So that was a big lie, that report, okay? And Hamilton and Kane have both said we were not given enough people, enough money, enough time. We were not given enough access to sensitive information, and so we were set up to fail. That's not me saying that. That's Kane and Hamilton saying that in their book, okay? So, and one might ask, you know, well, why did you tell us that when it was happening? But, you know, even if they did, probably wouldn't be in the major media. So, what are the facts? I've not been able to look into it as closely as possible, but I admire greatly these people who have been maligned as conspiracy theorists, you know. The conspiracy is the 9/11 Commission report, you know.
Yes.
And, you know, for people to be trying to find out the right answers to these things, I applaud them. You know, I think they're great. I couldn't encourage them more. And I read as much as I can about it. Now, people say to me, well, come on, Ray, don't you think, don't you believe that Dick Cheney is capable of something like 9/11?
Yes.
Right, that's what I say. Yeah, I believe that. But as you may recall, I don't do faith-based intelligence, okay? So it doesn't matter what I believe. It's the empirical evidence that I have to go to. Now, I'm not an investigative reporter. Believe it or not, it's a lot easier being an intelligence analyst because you have a little bit more leeway. You can pronounce yourself with lots of probables and you don't always need two sources. But I work for the best guy on the beat. His name is Robert Perry. He runs consortiumnews.com. He was the guy that not only identified Iran-Contra, but Ali North's role in it. He found out that neither with Newsweek nor with AP could he tell the truth, so he quit. In 1996, he set up his own little website, Consortium News. I am very delighted and very proud to publish there first, okay? Now he says, Ray, this is really baffling because with a crime of this magnitude, almost always you have somebody confiding in his girlfriend in some bar and says, yeah, well, you know, this is the way this went down, this 9/11 thing. You know, I was one of those guys wiring the buildings and, you know, so none of that ever happened, you know. There are lots of people that have theories and so forth. You don't have that kind of evidence that you would expect. So that gives me pause. I don't know what happened to Building 7. It seems almost a certainty to me that it was a controlled demolition, but I don't know how that relates to. So what I say is, look, we need an independent investigation for sure, and we're owed that, especially with these guys, these clowns saying, you know, we were set up to fail. I mean, well, hello, since it's the most important thing that happened in this generation, why don't we do it an independent job? So that's where I come out on this. I don't satisfy anybody by sounding wishy-washy. I'm not wishy-washy. I think the so-called conspiracy theorists are doing us all a very useful service. It's just that I can't say that I know enough or satisfied enough to come down with one of those theories.
How do you get to the independent investigation? How do you get there?
Well, that's the challenge. The question is, how do you get to an independent investigation? I guess the folks that are working on 9/11 theories and so need to do what they're doing. Just try to keep agitating for it, and hopefully there'll be some success before too long.
Thank you, Ray.
Oh, thank you, Rich. Please, brother.
And you'll stick around? You stick around for a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
So,
Well, thank you.